Hello friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, in this session we would be talking on education and overview, and this lecture is a part of an ongoing series on basic sociology. To take this lecture, we have our subject expert, Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Chaudhary is associated with Center for Study of Social System, JNU. So before we start the lecture, I would like to tell you that if you have any query regarding this lecture, you can call us on 1-800-110-430. So without wasting much time, I would like to request Professor Chaudhary to begin the lecture.
Thank you very much. So today, as has already been mentioned, we'll be speaking about education and overview, and as also been mentioned, this will be part of the basic sociology series, and in the many lectures that one has given, I have repeatedly emphasized the relationship between theory and the empirical. So we will go back to a lot of the sociological theory that we've already done in order to understand the empirical world of education. This will also help us to explore that what are the processes that constitute education beyond what we see at the common sense level. Some of the thinkers that we'll be looking at are Durkheim, Marx, Dewey, Parsons, Apple, and some of the many thinkers from our own country like Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, B.R. Ambedkar. I shall also be looking at education as a historical institution. By historical institution, we mean that we are looking at education as something that shifts from one period of time to another. We are also looking at education as a social institution. You will recall in our earlier lectures, we have discussed the family as a social institution, religion as a social institution, economy as a social institution. In the same manner, education too is a social institution with its own rules, regulation, norms and patterns of processes. To repeat, two aspects you must keep in mind when you look at education in society. One, that it is historical and therefore changes across time and changes across spaces. So education in our remote past, when we were living in a simple society, would be very different from education in a feudal society, from education in a modern and a global society. Number two, that education cannot be understood as an entity which is isolated from other aspects of society. So it has links with polity, economy, state, class, culture. These are some of the issues which we will be looking at as we move forward in this discussion. Some of the themes which are central in any understanding of any sociological phenomena, but particularly relevant to education as we approach it today. One, the relationship between the society and the individual. What is the role of education in socializing the individual, and what is the impact that it has on both society and individual, and is this socialization a neutral process? Can we agree to the point that education actually reproduces inequalities rather than redress inequalities, and can we understand education as a legitimation by dominant sections of society? If you look at these points which I have flagged off under education as a social institution, you will notice that there are two distinct strands. There are two different ways by which education is being looked at. One perspective which comes from what we call the functionalist, structural functionalist perspective in sociology, for example Durkheim and later Talcott Parsons, and the other which talks about education being part of society and therefore reflecting the class, caste, gender composition or structure of education, where the argument would be that education actually reproduces existing inequalities. This kind of argument usually comes from scholars who are inspired by Marx, later scholars like Althusser, who would see education as an ideological state apparatus. Much further, when we talk about allocation of resources and education, Michael Appel. So we have two different kinds of approaches to education, and now we move systematically forward. First, looking at the functionalist, structural functionalist perspective, in particular Emily Durkheim, whose work you are already familiar with in our earlier lectures. The point that I now pose before you is, how do we understand the social? And I quote directly from an original work, because one point that I've tried to constantly emphasize to you, whatever may be your background or your reasons for taking sociology, is that the original texts of these thinkers are an amazing wealth of information and inspiration, and you are encouraged therefore to go to the text. Here all that I can is, in a certain sense, give you a kind of preview of what those are in the text. It's in this context you can look at how Durkheim defines social facts and why logically education could be understood as a social fact. He defines social fact as consisting of ways of acting, thinking and feeling which are external to the individual and has a power of coercion that they can impose upon you. And these are not biological phenomena, they are not genetic, they are outside in the social, they are not psychological, they are outside in the social. So he distinguishes the social from the psychological and from the biological, and therefore he argues there is indeed a variety of phenomena to which the term social can be applied. Now, if you look at questions of education, you will understand that his insight of distinguishing the sociological from the biological and the psychological has so much relevance even today, because even today when we teach or when we study, very often we are tempted sometimes as teachers to argue that so and so is very bright because so and so comes from this kind of family or is from a particular ethnic or caste or a class or racial group. There is an understanding in the West, for example, that perhaps if you come from colored or black communities, you may not be so smart, and likewise in our country an argument that perhaps if you belong to certain marginalized groups, you may not be so bright or meritorious. Durkheim provides us an entry to understand that what is our ability as merit is actually socially constructed, neither biological nor psychological. He then furthers the understanding of education as linked to what he would call, and other sociologists later would call, the socialization process. Let me quote again so that you get a sense of what he means by the social as external and coercive. He argues that look at a little baby. When a baby is born, the first hours of his life, we compel him or her to eat, drink, sleep at regular hours. We constrain the child that you must be clean, don't be dirty, be calm, be obedient, listen to us. And we exert pressure if they violate and do not listen to us. And over a period of time, this repeated socialization leads to respect for custom and conventions, and even a certain drilling that you need discipline and work. This constraint ceases to be felt, Durkheim argues, over a period of time, and we start having habits and we do things almost subconsciously without having anybody actually to constrain or pressurize us. That it becomes internalized, it becomes part of us. So in the Durkheimian sense, education is very much a continuity of socialization. What is this traditional socialization model? It's a dominant approach which understands school in a simplistic and a unilinear fashion, that it socializes children. And the argument would be that schools provide experiences which instill knowledge, instill skills, attitudes and values, and these students are often seen as passive respondents of what is being taught to them, and over a period of time they learn the role structure of a modern society. As the competence, and here the argument gets a little more complicated, the argument being, in a modern society we need a more complex form of education which trains us with the skills and expertise that is required of the complex division of labor which is there in a modern society. For example, all of you are familiar, in our contemporary society we have so much new professions which we as young people never knew of. We hear daily of people. I mean, when I was a student in school, we didn't even have a section which was about commerce. It was humanities or science, and in humanities it was simply geography or history, or economics at the most. We didn't even have a subject like sociology, whereas today we have constantly, at one point of time with the coming of computers, you had computer professionals, new degrees, management courses, public relation, media, advertisement. I mean, we have range, a whole hotel management, questions of chef, beauty business. We have constantly new kind of expertise required in the running of a modern society, and education gets involved in this process. It takes over, from another time in a pre-modern society where very often the roles were very limited. You are either, it would be on the basis of gender and sex, you're a man or a woman. If you're a man, you're supposed to do this. If you're a woman, you're supposed to do this. Or in a caste driven society, that if you're born into a society, your ascribed identity, ascribed means the identity you have at birth decides what kind of work or what kind of job you ought to do. This changes in a modern society, but what remains true of contemporary societies is the fact that you have these, the idea of socialization and the aim of education to constitute the social being. The new little child is over a period of time made into a particular kind of person. Very early in their schooling, they learn they must compete, they must do well, they are put in a certain kind of discipline, and they become more and more like, in a certain sense, like everybody else. There is a certain kind of rote that takes place, and teachers and students too behave in a similar kind of fashion. Talcott Parsons, who comes many decades later after Durkheim, but he continues this argument of socialization and education being very central, and he also focuses on the needs of a modern, complex industrial society which requires very different kinds of education. What does he say? He understands the school as a very central agent of socialization. While the primary socialization takes place within the family, the school takes over as the focal socializing agency. The school acts as a bridge between family and society as a whole, preparing children for the adult roles in a society. Within the family, the child is judged by particularistic standards. Parents treat the child as their own, unique, special child, rather than judging him or her by universal standards that are applied to every individual. So when you grow up in your family, the entire reference, the frame of reference is the family. The norms are of the family. What is expected and how you are judged is decided by the family. This, however, changes dramatically when you go to the school. The school suddenly has its own criteria of judging whether you are smart or whether you are not smart, whether you are dressed well or whether you are not dressed well, or whether you are meritorious or whether you are slow. The school starts categorizing or deciding or classifying students in a particular fashion. In the wider society, the individual is therefore treated and judged in terms of universalistic standards which are applied to all members regardless of their kinship ties. And this gets far more competitive and complicated in the modern society as it has developed even from the times of Talcott Parsons. I myself am astonished by the fact that young students, as young as students in school, also have what is called a biodata or a CV. Right from the beginning, they are calculating how many awards they've got, how many scholarships they've got, how many prizes they have got, because right from the beginning, they are preparing themselves for the end. That, look, I will not get into a good college if I do not have these kind of awards in my pocket. Now, this kind of education again returns to the point where I began, that education changes historically, and education has to be understood in relation to the other social institutions of society like economy, polity, culture. So, the whole issue, that which I have given examples many times before, that in a simple society the idea of sharing and collective pleasure was prioritized. In a contemporary, modern, competitive society, it's very often your awards and your dreams and aspiration are individually oriented and achievement oriented, and very often you in fact perhaps look down upon collective efforts. And the worst forms would be when a young child even refuses to share the notes which the teacher has given in a class with another child, fearing that giving the notes may lead to greater marks got by the other child, which would leave one child less advantageous vis-a-vis these others. So, you notice here that whereas the functionalist perspective provides an understanding of socialization and education as secondary socialization as a process which equips the individual to fit into society, what it misses out is the fact that different children coming from different backgrounds are differentially trained. The most obvious part of it in a society like ours and many other societies across the world is the schooling system. We have different schools and we send our children to different schools depending upon our resources. That is, that if you belong to a very privileged background in India today, for example, you don't even want to opt for the Indian board education, and you may decide to put your child in a very exclusive private school which has international board exams. So, the idea is that once the child passes out of school, they may go abroad or elsewhere into the global education market or the global educational system. Lower down, we may have, at one point we had excellent public schools, public educational systems. Everybody actually went to government schools. Many of our great stalwarts of the nationalist movement, social reformers, authors, writers, everybody went to such schools. But over a period of time, we have had a deterioration leading to greater differentiation, where the middle class family would strive to send their child to what would be considered a privileged school, an elite private school, which would provide the child greater opportunities in the future. You can see it's almost like an assembly line. That is, you're not sending your child to the school so the child is educated in the larger sense of the term and enjoys their stint in school, but in order that you pass through school into a particular kind of board exams, into going abroad, or particular board exam into certain kind of entrance exam, and into maybe an engineering college or a medical college or some other kind of professional courses that you are aspiring to. So, the functionalists assume that the social that they are talking about is homogeneous, is uniform. But if you look empirically into any society, most societies are divided. They have various kinds of people with different kinds of background. So, in our country today, unfortunately, very often we have very different kinds of school training very different abilities. You have heard in recent times reports that poor children who have made so much effort to go to a school, but who are unable even to read or write or do the most simple calculations that are required, Now, let's go back to Talcott Parsons for a minute and try to see that whether the critique that one is suggesting of the functionalist method actually operates or doesn't operate. The school prepares people for the transition from the family to the larger world, and in terms of more broader universalistic standards of merit or competence or ability. Their conduct is assessed against the yardstick of school rules, their achievement measured by standardized examination. The same standards are applied to all pupils regardless of ascribed characteristics such as sex, race, family, background, class of origin. Schools therefore operate on meritocratic principles. Like Durkheim, Parsons therefore argues that the school represents society in a miniature form. Modern industrial society is increasingly based on achievement rather than description, on universalistic rather than particularistic standards, on meritocratic principles which apply to all its members. By reflecting the operation of society as a whole, the school prepares young people for their adult roles. But look, if you look at that, we know, for example, the school you go to depends upon the ability of your parents or your family to send you to the kind of schools. Everybody, I am sure every mother, every father, every family would want to provide their children the best education possible. But the best education is not possible on the idea of free education. It is possible on how much money you can afford in order to enter the educational system, which takes us back that are we really providing a kind of education which is completely bias free, irrespective of caste, class, creed, race, gender. Theoretically, yes, everybody has equal right to education. Empirically, no, because which school you go to would depend upon the kind of background you come from. But much more than that, apart from the fact that you are actually denied or cut off from the best education, the marginalized would also face different kind of issues within the schools that they go to. Because very often there is a tendency in the standard pedagogy in classrooms that we would treat different students differently. We know very often how we would classify the good girl or the good boy from the bad girl and the bad boy. So there would be an orientation of being attracted or drawn to certain kind of children who conform to what is expected. If they are obedient, docile, those chances of those children being thought of as good children would be higher. If there is a child who wants to ask interesting questions, difficult questions, a standard approach may be to suggest, please be obedient, don't ask stupid questions. Now here therefore comes the critique of a functionalist education, that does it really respond to the social as a comprehensive or as a holistic perspective, or is it something which is far more limited? This is something we have to look into, and in contrast to the structural functionalist perspective, we have the other tradition, that is the Marxist perspective on education. The Marxist perspective on education in fact looks at the social as something which is inherently complex, something which is divided by the differential access to resources. Now when we look at the idea of Marx, it's not that Marx has a separate section or a separate book on education. So you have to derive his understanding of education from his broader understanding of what a modern capitalistic society would be. And his argument would be that in any society where you have division of property and differential control of property and private resources, you would have differential access to cultural, educational, social resources. Many decades later, Pierre Bourdieu, who also worked on education and was inspired by Marx, used the word cultural capital, social capital. We know how often people who have a certain felicity with the English language or a certain kind of cultural capital of being confident often manage perhaps to get a job. How does that happen? Therefore, the idea of capital has to be understood not only in terms of the strict economic capital of certain kind of resources or property, but the other kind of cultural or social capital which accrue to you because you belong to a particular kind of family. All of you would be familiar with the industry of tuition which has cropped up in our country in contemporary times. Very often, parents who send their children to schools from the marginalized section and themselves have never been to schools or been to schools only to a limited extent are not in a position to help their children with their homework or help their children prepare for their examination. They are naturally disadvantaged, whereas maybe in the same class, if you have parents who are educated, they would be in a position to help their children to prepare. So you have this differential allocation of resources which make the concept of social with which we begin far more complicated, and it needs to be looked at. What needs to be looked at also is the concept of freedom. Whereas on one hand, we have a perspective which talks of education as discipline, socializing, as structuring them in a particular fashion, we have another understanding of education which is about freedom, the ability to be yourself, the ability to discover yourself. It is there in the writings of Marx. In a very different world, in a very different context, it's there in the words of writings of Sri Aurobindo, where the argument is, don't look at the child as a passive victim and coerce the child into set forms of knowledge, but let the child discover the joys and processes of learning by themselves, and in this knowledge the idea of experience becomes very central. The vision that Marx had, and I quote here, education is free. Freedom of education in a socialist society will be enjoyed under the condition fixed by law and under the supreme control of the state. Here, to understand this quote, you have to understand the argument that he felt that in a society which is divided by private property, education will also be differentially accessed, and this is something which influenced not only socialist societies but capitalist societies like West Europe and North Europe, where, as you know, whether it's Germany, whether it's French, France or Denmark, in many of these societies education is free, schooling is free. Public schools very often are of a very, very high quality, and very, very few people send their children to schools. To conclude, before we break for a few minutes, we have to realize, therefore, education is a social institution that historically is varied and develops differently in different periods of time. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for this session. Dear friends, we will be continuing with this lecture in a short while. So keep watching, stay tuned with us. Thank you. Welcome friends, let's continue with the lecture what we are having in the first session on education and overview. So I request ma'am to start the lecture and continue.
Okay, thank you very much. In our earlier section, we spent more time discussing the manner in which functionalists and structural functionalists, particularly Durkheim and Parsons, looked at education as socializing individuals so that they could perform the roles that are allotted to them in a society, and in the case of Parsons, particularly in a modern industrial society, And I gave you empirical instances of how each of us, even now when early in school, we are geared to do well and excel so that we can do better when we move out of school. So very early on in school, we are taught and prepared. Like even relatives will ask you, are you good in maths? Are you good in science? And if you're not good in maths and if you're not good in science, then there is an issue or a problem. So there is always a forward looking at the future and a particular kind of goal. And the goals are not the goals which you set it out for yourself. Very often we hear of people who wanted to be sports persons, or maybe an actor, or maybe a musician. But the demands of the time were such that they had to be an engineer and actually spend 4 or 5 years doing an engineering before they could come back to their first love or their first passion. So there is a certain kind of coercion in the sense that Durkheim talks about of what is expected of individuals from the perspective of the needs and requirements of the society. We also looked at in the last section when we look at Marx or look at other scholars influenced by Marx like Apple, which we will discuss a little later in today's discussion, that they were talking about education not just as a system of socialization, but education as a system of allocation. What do we mean by education as a system of allocation? Education is a system of allocation, confers success on some, failure on others. Allocation theory focuses on educational effects on individuals being processed. It turns out to be a special case of a more general macro-sociological theory on the effects of education as a system of legitimation. Education restructures whole populations, creating and expanding elites and redefining the rights and obligations of members. Institutional effects of education as a legitimate system. And I began with this understanding that there is a very close relationship between theory and empirical research. And if any of you are in research, or maybe just out of sheer sense of fun or applying to what you are learning, try and see comparative study that are these points that people who subscribe to the theory of education or system of allocation, does it work? Does it confer success on some and failure on others? How many people you have heard, little children who have seen themselves as failures? We have a tragic situation where young children of class 10 and class 12 suicide. We have a situation where before the board exams, we have the state and the market, everybody putting up helplines so that children in crisis can ring them up and ask for succor. Is this right? Is this correct? What are we doing to our children if the idea of failure is so intense, so terribly intense that somebody decides that killing themselves is better than living? Look at what this concept of failure means and how transient very often the concept of success is. So very often we may have people who have done outstandingly well in their board exams. They have topped, the newspapers have taken photographs, parents and grandparents and relatives are excited. It would be interesting as an exercise of sociology to follow the trajectory of these successful students and find out whether their success continues till the very end. If it did, then we would not probably have situations where we have people in IITs, which should be the ultimate epitome of success, suiciding too. We need, therefore, as social scientists and sociologists, to look at the concept of success and failure as universalist criteria far more carefully than we do. Why do we say systems of legitimation? And I recall that some of you who had listened to me in my earlier lectures did refer, what do we mean by legitimation, or what do we mean by hegemony? Legitimation means that you are given a certain kind of rationalization or award, that look, you are a good person, you are a smart person, you are successful. You may be given a particular award or a particular kind of certification. Certification is a very important part of modern education. I, as a child, never had a certificate because that was not part of the education system at that point of time. But increasingly we notice we have more and more competition, more and more certification. And certification is a process of legitimation in the sense that it acquires a certain kind of recognition by authority in a given society, that it is legitimized. Whereas if you are not so smart, maybe in science, maybe in mathematics, maybe you have not acquired so many certifications, you are rendered delegitimate, you are a failure. A certain kind of branding, which is a very, very dangerous word, but the word of branding has been discussed to a great extent in sociology of education. The other argument of systems of education and systems of allocation is that it's not just the individuals who are being defined as a failure or as a success, as a person who has a great deal of merit, or as somebody who is very dumb, but the entire society has sections of population who are seen as the star kids. There are schools, for example, where students who have get a certain kind of marks wear different kinds of blazers. Nothing can be more blatant than this, that you're actually carrying legitimation on what you are wearing. Those who are not, therefore, they are not meritorious. You therefore are creating a new group of expanding elites. And this has a great impact on the manner of structure of education. Some people give up by killing themselves. Some people are muted. You know how we mute the television, muted being depressed, low self-confidence, and some people rebel by doing terrible things, rebel by being deviant, rebel by being not conforming to education, and the dominant education would still see them as failure, whereas perhaps the rebel would grow up to be somebody who would be very, very successful even by the mainstream yardstick. So remember, you have to understand education as socialization, but you also have to understand that the social needs careful critiquing. It is not a homogeneous entity, and therefore the understanding of education as a system of allocation. One of the most well-known sociologists of education is Michael Apple. He is an American, influenced both by older critical sociology ideas of Marx as well as great interest in contemporary education in the West, talks about how if you want to understand education, you have to understand it in its interaction with three systems: culture, government, and economy. See how different this perspective is from a perspective where you say education socializes the individual in order to fit in to the roles of a modern industrial society. Here the argument is that, look, it's not as simple as that. You can't take it for granted. This is a common sense understanding of education. Education is linked to three other systems: culture, government, and economy. We can see it happening in our own country. Let me give you a very quick example how different kinds of governments or states would have very different kinds of priorities in education. During the British rule, during colonial period, the British had a certain vision of education for natives like us, and they had what were called the Macaulay's Minutes. They wanted to create Indians who were brown in color, obviously, but who thought like the British and would therefore rule in place of the British over the rest of the country. The British education policies also did not want to have an educational policy which would encourage critique, questioning, rebellion. However, the fact that they did introduce liberal education led to unintended consequences. They intended to create black or brown sahibs, but the unintended consequences was that the early Indian middle class, which were exposed to Western education, were inspired by the ideas of democracy, French Revolution, ideas of Rousseau and Locke, ideas of Marx, ideas of Bacon, and critiqued. We had already talked in the earlier classes on Raja Ram Mohan Roy's idea of constitutional liberalism. We've looked at how all the colonial rulers, all the Indian leaders during the colonial period were so influenced, and they were taking those resources of Western education to question colonial government. How did it change after 1947 when we became independent? The Indian government had a different set of priorities from the colonial government. They wanted to spread education because the slogan of those early years of the Indian state was equity with growth. So we must grow, we must have science and technology, we must set up IITs, we must set up IIMs, we must have steel industry, we must encourage science and research. But at the same time, we must also expand primary education, because we have to reach out to the weakest members of the society. So national education was very, very different. They also critiqued much of the biases of Western education, which was assumed that Indians were barbaric and did not have their own knowledge systems or their own ability, their own novels, their own poetry, their own ways of looking at the world. But we've been having a period over the last 70 years, as our education system has expanded, we have rediscovered so many of those scholars of that period of time, not only people who knew their tradition, but were also very, very familiar with modern forms of education. So the government of the national period of the early decades after independence had a certain vision of national education. What about what is often called the neoliberal government or the neoliberal state, which is the dominant form till maybe just last year, or a neoliberal economy? The argument that the state should not spend so much on education, we should withdraw from education, and the private sector should be encouraged, something which all of you would be familiar of, the number of private universities which have cropped up literally overnight in the last decades. You cannot go drive down the roads without seeing those huge billboards which would only advertise earlier television sets or maybe particular apartments were now selling education. So you have different governments having different impact on education. You have different forms of culture impacting different forms of education. So if you have a hegemonic means a kind of dominant section putting forward a notion of one kind of culture that would be imposed on all students, you would have a very different kind of education. Like in the West, where the attempt at one point of time would be that certain notions of whiteness would be put forward to all students from a time when multiculturalism became the norm. In our country, along with equity and growth, we had this amazing slogan of unity and diversity, recognition of different cultures, and therefore the attention in our education policy about language, about learning in your mother tongue, about learning 3 languages, that you know your own language, you know English, but you also know the language of some other community with whom you are interacting and who are part of your life. So Michael Apple brought forth this obvious point that education has to be linked to culture, to government, and to economy. He also was trying to look at the whole question that, is it true, can we go to a certain kind of reductionist Marxist understanding that there is a conspiracy and we have a small group of industries which keep the school completely under their control, and therefore we have a mechanical production of labor. So the school produces certain kind of children who will become maybe a fourth grade labor, certain kind of children who will become doctors and lawyers, certain other kind. It's not fully wrong if you do a kind of empirical study and find out which kind of schools produce which kind of skills. I think this would come out quite clearly. But the point that he was trying to say, yes, there is hegemony, yes, there is control of industry, but it would be wrong to see that whether everybody is passively accepting that. He argues that, look, just like workers are, there are attempts to control workers, but workers may go on strike and they may be resisting. Likewise, even in a classroom, you may have institutional processes to control them, but children would rebel, children would be disobedient, and you would have the possibility of contradiction and resistance, what he calls a relative autonomy and transformation. And you may have the most imaginative, creative person coming out from that kind of processes. This returns us to the question where we began with, the relationship between society and the individual, and the fact that social reproduction is by its nature a contradictory process, not something that simply happens without a struggle. Now, Apple continues to talk about how education is impacted by state policy makers and educational material producers. And I've already given you the example of how the colonial state policy had a certain kind of education, the early Indian nation state had a certain kind of policies, and after 1991, when you had an opening up of the economy or liberalization, and particularly over the last few years, we've had an expansion of privatized education. Private education, which is encouraged very often, arguing that state education is not efficient enough. Now, there is no time to go into it, but this point returns to the issue of how we cannot understand education as an isolated entity, but has to be understood in its relationship to culture, to government, and to the economy. The other point of Apple, that despite the coercion, despite dominance and hegemony, people do question, people do rebel, and so therefore the outcome that we have may be more complicated than we anticipated. In our own country, we've had some remarkable thinkers on education. One is Gandhiji and his understanding of basic education, where he wanted to bring in local crafts and productive skills so that the child didn't feel alienated. Very often empirical studies of school education have seen that maybe a child who's used to working on the field or running around in a village finds it very difficult to sit and pay attention to a very abstract kind of curriculum. So Gandhiji anticipated this many decades earlier and talked about getting local crafts and production skills right into the schools, bringing experience to the sense. That was one part. The other part was very revolutionary, because he wanted to question the existing system of education. When he said that children should clean their toilets, he was actually asking about questioning the basic parameters of what is expected and what is not expected in education. Now, I just want to very quickly, I'm not going to speak too long on it, because I've already talked about unequal allocation of resources, I've already talked about public and private, socialization, roles, but we must look into gender as an organizing principle of society, and the fact that, gender has been extremely central in deciding what kind of education certain kind of people should take and what other kind of education certain kind of people. In the 19th century, very often, girls were not allowed to be educated, and there were attempts for girls to, go into schools and have all girls schools so that parents would be encouraged. all the social reform movements took up girls' education. Unfortunately, even today, as girls' education have expanded, we do have certain kind of differentials persisting. So on one hand, we have girl toppers being feted after the board exam results are out. On the other hand, we do have a dropout rate of more girls and more children of marginalized section. So we've talked about Gandhi, and I want to talk about somebody who is very influenced by Gandhi and also by Tagore, a contemporary educationist of Krishna Kumar. I encourage you to read his writing on who is educated and who is not, and he gives a very poignant story about what is our standard notion of education. He gives the example, and it is there in the PowerPoint, so you can read it for yourself, of a domestic worker who cannot read the Western calendar. And he writes, my illiterate house help uses the Indian calendar and has little knowledge of the Western calendar. We often have considerable difficulty determining what we are meaning when we talk to each other. As an uneducated person, she expects that I won't know the system she is used to, and I, as an educated person, expects that she might know only the Indian system. Our ignorance of each other's calendar contributes to our identities as educated and uneducated people. So it is very important, he says, that she thinks I may not know what the Savan is, and I would think she would not know, for example, what April or June would be. And very often it would so be that I would belong to a more privileged caste and she would belong perhaps to a lower caste background, and this kind of knowledge dichotomy is very much present even in a contemporary period. However, when the Brahmin priest uses the Indian calendar, it's not the same as my illiterate domestic help, because in that role, the idea he is talking not as a modern educated man, but in a capacity as the status of a Brahmin priest. So this is a very, very interesting and offers you a way to look at the kind of conflicts, contradictions which exist in our contemporary educational system. Now, as I sort of slowly move and wind up my talk, I want to give you a certain understanding of a comparison between a traditional vision of education, which more or less conforms to what the structural functionalist form of education would be, and what would be a critical form of education or the new form of education. In the traditional form of education, a point that I have repeatedly stated right through today's lecture, is the chief business of school is to transmit them to a new generation, and new skills, new norms, new practices have to be communicated to them. The subject matter is also fixed. The ideas of proper conduct is fixed. What is receptivity, obedience, everything is fixed. It's not just your curriculum which is fixed, the syllabi which is fixed, but even the school organization is fixed. You must stand in a particular line, you must get into the assembly. There are strict schedules. This is a certain traditional form of education. One of the early thinkers of education, John Dewey from America, was one of the early academics, philosophers and public intellectual who was very, very unhappy with this traditional, or what would be called didactic, education of the schools of America in the early 20th century, not very different from the way our education system would operate. What is the sum of the common features of the new school of education? The old school, the traditional school, everything was fixed. Curriculum fixed, exam fixed, schedule fixed, organization fixed, ideas of merit and competence fixed, idea of success and failure fixed. New school of education, like Tagore, who I'll just touch upon very briefly as we move forward, great focus on freedom, like the idea which we talked about when we talked about Marx. No coercion, no imposition, no external discipline. Like Gandhi, learn not just from text but experience. Acquisition of skills and techniques, not just by drills, like by repeatedly repeating something, but by actually knowing how to use them. The difference, say, by learning rote, 2 2s are 4, 2 4s are 8, at actually doing an experiment of counting or multiplying may bring about very different kind of experiences. So Dewey is somebody, if any of you are interested in education, would be a person who would be wonderful to look back at. Now look back again, I talked about Tagore, but look at what Tagore said about education. Again, no imposition, freedom. You're familiar with his experiment in Shantiniketan, his idea of Vishwa Bharati. Some few sayings of Tagore, you can read it for yourself. You can't cross the sea by merely standing and staring at the water. That is no textual knowledge. A mind all logic is like a knife all blade. It makes the hand bleed that uses it. That compassion feeling is as critical as logic. Butterfly counts not months but moments and has time enough. Look at our modern education. The child has weekly tests, then monthly tests, then the term test, then the annual test, then tuition. So where is the question of enjoying the moment that is there? Lastly, we have Ambedkar, again a great thinker from our times. I'm not going to read it out, it's there in your PowerPoint. The idea that for the marginalized communities, education was central for them to have a respectable life and belief in self-help. Cultivation of mind, the ultimate aim of human existence. And very interestingly, the question of women. I measure the progress of a community by the degree of progress which women have achieved. I just 2 lines about the overview of education. Education varies from one point of history to the other. Education is linked to other social institutions, be it family, religion, culture, politics, economy. Education has to be understood as something which does not only cater to the social needs in an undifferentiated form, but socialization will be very different depending upon the background that you come from. So the idea of allocation of resources has to be looked at. You have to look at our own thinkers from our country to reflect whether we are going ahead in the right direction, or should we stop for a moment and think what is it which is going wrong and what is it which is going right. Before I completely wind up for the day, there are a couple of points I would like to respond to in the queries that you've posed for my lectures. One of them, which may be relevant for a lot of you, is the sequence of lecturing. Now, I started off with the emergence and growth of sociology. I talked later of classical sociologists. I talked about micro-sociologists and the critical sociologists after that. And I then spoke on particular thinkers like Bourdieu, Foucault, and I talked about feminist theory to some large extent. I began the feminist theory first with a lecture on common sense and feminist theory before I started talking about feminist theory in particular. There are 3 of them in feminist theory. The last talks about many of our own Indian feminist writers and thinkers. I then spoke on media as a social institution, and finally today education as a social institution. The other point that some of you have raised is what is hegemony. Hegemony is questions of dominance. There are no way that I can respond to all the queries, but I look forward to your responses, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this lecture. Dear friends, if you have any query regarding this lecture, please write us on info.cec@nic.in. I repeat, info.cec@nic.in. And I again thank ma'am for such lecture. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.